Welcome back. As we continue thinking about Hebrew historiography, I want us to try to get our minds around some issues that we wrestle with when we work with Hebrew history. So, here's a real case study. Quite a few folks in Jim Anderson's congregation read the New York Times, and they came across this article, this essay, and brought it up in Bible study class, who in turn roped Pastor Jim into the discussion. Here's what this column said. The way I understand the archaeological finds, there is no evidence whatsoever for a great united monarchy which ruled from Jerusalem over large territories, said Israel Finkelstein, the director of the Institute of Archaeology at Tel Aviv University. King David's Jerusalem, he added, was no more than a poor village at the time. Well, this debate over the veracity of the biblical accounts was recently fought out in a lively issue of Biblical Archaeology Review, a bi-monthly magazine published in Washington, in which one of the minimalists, the British scholar Philip Davies, wrote that biblical accounts of early Israel are purely theological and not historical. So, what are the issues? And if you were Pastor Jim, how would you respond? Seriously. Well, here's another. One of your parishioners got hold of a copy of David Strauss' Life of Jesus, where he came across a claim that, one, got him thinking, and two, brought him to you to sort it out together. See, Strauss considers a text unhistorical when the narration is irreconcilable with known universal laws which govern the course of events. He goes on, now according to these laws, agreeing with all just philosophical conceptions and all credible experience, the absolute cause never disturbs the chain of secondary causes by single arbitrary acts on interposition, but rather manifests itself in the production of the aggregate of finite causalities and of their reciprocal action. When, therefore, we meet an account of certain phenomena or events of which is expressly stated or implied that they were produced immediately by God Himself, voices or apparitions, or by human beings possessed of supernatural powers, miracles, prophecies, such an account is insofar to be considered as not historical. I realize that was kind of academic language, but you get the point. The arguments being made out there, what are some of the implications of these sorts of positions? I mean, is the biblical claim of inspiration and revelation rational? Are the voices heard in the night like Samuel heard at Eli's place? Or stories of miracles like in the Elijah narrative, 16 of them? Or the Elisha narratives, 32. So are those accounts historical? Well, here's a syllogism that I think many contemporary historians live by. A, any text that violates known universal laws that determine events is unhistorical. That's what David Strauss was arguing. B, any text that reports divine intervention violates universal laws that determine events. Therefore, Any text that reports divine intervention is unhistorical. All right, we've thought about definitions, and we've thought about some of the issues we face as students of the Bible and teachers and preachers of the Bible. Let's think about limitations and characteristics, and then wrap this conversation up. Limitations. Number one, limitations of available data. You remember several weeks ago we talked about how historian Edwin Yamauchi illustrated that only a fraction of 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 a fraction, that's 6 out of 100,000, only that, 6 100,000ths of everything that was ever made, I mean buildings, artifacts, pots, pans, documents, whatever had been written, only that fraction has survived and being discovered and analyzed and published. For example, the Dead Sea Scrolls. You read a lot about them. They were traveling around various museums around the United States recently. We're here in the Twin Cities. The remainder of the Dead Sea Scrolls that had survived and been discovered weren't published until the preliminary edition was published in 1991. And then the facsimile edition was published just in 2007, 2008. You've also got limitations of linguistic and literary competence. It's a long time ago in our reckoning, but it's really not all that long ago in world history that we first discovered how to read hieroglyphics. The writings that are all over the monuments in Egypt. Even in understanding biblical Hebrew. The authorized version, the King James Version, translates ruach as ghost. Then there's the matter of perspective. You see, the natural, inevitable stance of reading an ancient Oriental text as if it were from my time and place, oblivious to the presuppositions and values and idioms and styles of the writers and that were familiar to the first audience. That difference in perspective can create issues, can't it? Or the perspective one has toward the Bible. I mean, is it just religious literature without any historical truth? Or, as some would argue, is it religious literature, true for me, but maybe not for you, and there are other texts that may be true for other people? Or are we dealing with inspired scripture with valid truth claims? Long's discussion of the stresses presented by various presuppositions of modern historians is telling. Atheistic and Marxist presuppositions tend to deny or ignore the supernatural and the spiritual. So it's no stretch of the imagination to see the difficulties scholars from this perspective will have with Hebrew history, where spiritual understandings and commitments play such a role, not only at the personal and family level, but in the larger society as well. Think about that for a minute, and when we get back, I want us to think about some of the characteristics of Hebrew history. See you in a bit.